Welcome, everyone. My name is Francesca Iacorto. I am an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. I'm also the Senior Director of Public Affairs at the National Airlines Council of Canada. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre is a progressive centrist think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. In that context, I am pleased to welcome you to the 5th webinar on major policy issues related to COVID-19 and how they are affecting our society. Today, we will talk about how COVID-19 has affected the travel and tourism sector. We know the effects have been devastating. So what we want to do today is explore the degree of difficulty the sector is having and how it can recover from this in the months and years ahead. Before doing that, though, I want to take a moment to thank two sustaining sponsors without whose help these sessions would not be possible. First, we have Canada's Building Trades Unions, and second, we have the International Association of Firefighters. Now back to the panel. We have four very knowledgeable panelists who know and care about this field deeply, and I'd like to thank all of them for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. First, we have Phil Mondor, who is the President and CEO of the Tourism HR Council, which is the leading voice on issues of human resources needs, present and future for the tourism sector. We also have with us Keith Henry, who is the President and CEO of the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada. ITAC focuses on creating partnerships between associations, organizations, government departments, and industry leaders to support the growth of Indigenous tourism in Canada and address the demand for authentic Indigenous experiences. We also have with us today Sarah Chown, who's the managing partner of the Metropolitan Brasserie, a very well-known and popular spot near Parliament Hill in Ottawa. She's also the Ottawa Regional Chair of the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association. And last but not least, we have my boss, Mike McNanny, who is the President and CEO of the National Airlines Council of Canada, which is the association that represents Canada's largest national and international airlines, namely Air Canada, Air Transat, WestJet, and Jazz. Our moderator today will be Andrew Cardozo, who's the president of the Pearson Centre, and he also writes a weekly column for the Hill Times on various public policy issues. With respect to the format, the panel discussion will last about 40 minutes and will then be followed by a Q&A session with you, the audience, before we end promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Please use the question box on your screen and we will get to as many questions as we can. The session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson YouTube channel later on this afternoon. And on that note, I will turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Francesca, and welcome everybody. I just want to add a word of thanks to Phil Mondor for assisting in the construction of today's discussion. I've had the good fortune of working with him and the Tourism HR Council in partnership over many years, and it's always fun to work with you again. So let me put you on the spot, Phil, first. Paint us a picture of the situation faced by the tourism sector today.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Let me start by just throwing out a few numbers. Destination Canada, which many people will know, recently commissioned some research by McKinsey and Company, and I'm just going to cite one of their numbers, but I'll delve a little bit deeper here. Their recent research indicated that without further government investments, 1,000 tourism businesses, or about 57% of the total, are projected to fail. And the more staggering number for me is that 1.66 million tourism sector employees could be laid off. That represents about 83% of the workers in the sector. And what's important to keep in mind is that many of those workers are groups that are of most concern, like women, youth, new Canadians, Indigenous workers, of course, and others. Just so you know as well, when we've been tracking the impacts on the workforce, and within the first month of the shutdown, there were 450,000 jobs that were lost. And in the second month, April, there were 440,000 jobs lost. That represented about 43% of the market. So we took a very big hit very early. Last month, we saw a little bit of recovery. There was about 84,000 jobs that started to return, but I can assure you that we know this will be a much slower return. We will not see our numbers get back to our normal complement for well over 2 years, perhaps 3. And one final note I'll leave on that without going too deep into numbers, but for those that are interested, the unemployment rate in this sector is more than double of what it is for the Canadian labor force overall. So of course I did focus on the labor issues because that's our mandate, but indeed I know others can tell you about some of the impacts specifically on businesses. Thanks, Andrew.
And in terms of businesses, does it mean that a lot of tourism operators, if I can use that term widely, are just not able to offer any services?
That is correct. There's something like more than about half of them are not operating whatsoever. And of the others that are operating, it's at a far diminished level of services. In fact, like hotels, for example, only about 10% occupancy rate for those that are open. And as you well know, you'll hear from other panelists on here, some restaurants have been shuttered entirely and are just now starting to reopen. And you'll hear from others still, there are services that will probably not open this fall or summer because of constrictions or restrictions in terms of the ability to open. So yes, it's been hugely impacted, very significant numbers where they simply are not able to operate whatsoever.
Yeah. Keith, can I ask you, I gather the Indigenous tourism industry, the sector, represents urban and non-urban providers, businesses. How are they faring today?
Yeah, I mean, just building off what Phil sort of painted the picture, but we have about 1,800 businesses in this country spread out through every province and territory, owned primarily by communities or entrepreneurs. And it's been absolutely devastating to our sector. There's very few of those businesses that are trying to stay in operation right now. They employ roughly about 40,000 people, and of that right now, the bulk of them are just simply not staying open, even in spite of some of the government programs that have been put in place. So, you know, the issue across our country right now is simply we're getting hit from two sides. There just is not a paying customer due to the restrictions and the certain levels of that. But what we also have to deal with is the social license issue within Indigenous nations. And many of our businesses are unresolved. And no matter whether provinces or territories or municipalities try to reopen, they're also not going to allow their businesses to reopen because they feel it's not safe yet until the vaccine's found. So in many parts of this country, despite what you're hearing on the media, and despite municipal, federal, provincial, territorial governments saying, well, we're going to reopen, some nations are forcing their business sectors to stay closed. And so this is a really significant impact to us. And we just came off a record-breaking year. So it's really an unfortunate time for us.
So there are large areas where people are asking tourists not to come there, even if the businesses do open.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Yeah. An example that is Haida Gwaii. It's a beautiful destination on British Columbia. Well, the Council of Haida Nation, they have a number of businesses, a cultural center, outdoor adventure, local Indigenous fishing guides, a number of things. And the nation itself has made a decision. They don't want visitors to come to Haida Gwaii until the vaccine's found. So they're literally greeting people that are going there by BC ferries and asking them not to come to Haida Gwaii. So you can imagine the impacts to a number of the Indigenous-owned businesses on Haida Gwaii. There's not just Indigenous tourism. There's a bigger issue here that we have to deal with it over time, and so it's pretty significant. And that's many examples of that across the country.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Can I ask you, in terms of the Ottawa restaurant, hotel, and motel industries, what's the status?
I can give you more kind of numbers on an Ontario level. We started to see business decline far before the pandemic was actually declared, as I'm sure most other sectors and parts of this sector did. We started seeing declines in February. Numbers across full service restaurants were down just about 45% in February. And then you started to see that number drastically increase throughout March. So The first couple of weeks of March were down 78, and then, you know, bam, everything hit. We got shut down, and then you started seeing numbers at about 95%. So currently, up till the end of May, we're looking at a 95% decline in revenues, which is very substantial, as you can imagine. Nearly half of single unit restaurants are closed right now and are not open for any form of takeout delivery. 10% have permanently closed, and projections are that you'll probably see 50% close if things don't start to normalize a bit in the next 3 months. So it's far from over. You're going to start to see things shut down even as things reopen. Right when we got on this call, actually, I got a note from a friend of mine who owns a restaurant in the market. They're not opening. They have a tiny patio, maybe seats 10 tables. They're closing. They've been open for takeout and they're done. They're calling it a day. In Ottawa, there's a couple restaurants in the Glebe already that are not opening. I've heard of a number of them. So the struggle is real, I will say.
When you say not opening for now, or they're closing?
They're pulling the plug. They're pulling the plug. They don't see any sort of financial viability in this business model. You're looking at recovery times of, you know, best guess 2022.
If you're looking at we're here in June, this would be the start of your high season. Are any tourists coming to Ottawa? Is it like what percent? What's your guesstimate of what percentage compared to last year?
I haven't heard of many coming in. I have a lot of hotel contacts here. Like we've mentioned, occupancy rates at hotels are down significantly, 10% and under. If we do start to see tourism coming, it's going to be driving mostly, I am expecting. It's going to be, you know, as maybe furthest Toronto, I would say, would be my best guess. People aren't at the level where they're looking to jump on the plane and come to Ottawa. I mean, it's just, people are afraid, and maybe rightly so.
Yeah. And speaking about jumping on a plane, Mike, let me ask you, what's the situation facing the airline industry?
Well, I'm going to add to the sobering conversation, unfortunately. A lot of parallels with the numbers that were being mentioned too, and numbers in particular that Sarah was mentioning. The capacity is down about 95%. So you're operating about 5% or less of your capacity. There is over $10 billion worth of aircraft that are sitting idle, and not in operation. You're down to probably less than 30% of the workforce actually fully engaged at the moment. And the biggest thing, and I'm sure it's for everybody else here on the panel too, the biggest thing is there's no clear time frame on when things are actually going to turn. And certainly part of what we are trying to do now is see if we can at least capture some of the summer market and not lose everything going forward. And just to show you how important it was for me to participate on this, about 10 minutes before we got on this call, a crown fell off on my tooth up here. So I'm going to talk like this because I have a big gap that makes me look like an NHL hockey player, which I am not. But I'm still very happy to be here for the conversation.
Well, good luck being able to go to a dentist these days. That's a tough profession because they've got to be masked and gowned all day, and not having to look inside people's mouths all day. Anyhow, I won't go there. So Mike, where do we go from here? The summer is coming up. Do you see business travel? Business travel is not going to pick up in the summer anyhow. Who's going to be traveling in the summer in the next 2.5 months?
Well, there's a couple of processes underway. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, released a report last week called CART, which is basically putting out the template and the process and recommendations they think aviation should follow globally. And it basically starts from when the passenger is at their house before they get to the airport, and all their movement through the processors and on board the aircraft, service on board the aircraft, etc. We've got a large degree of engagement from industry and with governments around the world to actually make the CART process and template. the global standard. And there's a lot of things which carriers and airports are now already doing that are tied straight to that. So we have to be able to get all these processes in place, a number of which are already done. That is going to give greater confidence, I think, to consumers and to regulators. The bottom line, and it cascades a little bit on the point that Keith was making, the bottom line within aviation is until we can truly address the travel and border restrictions, and of course we now have different restrictions within Canada as well across provinces, until we can truly address that, you are not going to see sustained recovery within aviation. And I suspect down that we're now operating at less than 5% capacity. And you're also seeing the numbers drop globally as well. The IATA figures that came out yesterday are very sobering. The cascading impact across all of tourism will be, I'm afraid, quite negative.
And when the industry is being careful about opening up, how much of that is restrictions imposed on you by the government, and how much of it is either the industry being careful or, as you say, the customer is not coming? Is it a combination of all those three?
Well, right now you have so little capacity out there. There's very little selection and choice for consumers to look at. And then when you have the border restrictions cascading forward, both the transborder and international, again, there's a reduction in just capacity and options for people to choose. And then, of course, as consumers look at the differences across province to province and potentially having to then self-quarantine, again, it all takes away the incentive to do the travel. As far as what the industry is doing, and again, this is both airports and airlines, there's a great deal of activity that started well over a month ago in terms of changing your standard operating procedures, in terms of cleaning process, et cetera. And that is to not just give consumers confidence, but obviously, of course, it's also for employees and protecting employees and giving them confidence. So I think if we can start to get all these measures more in the public realm and people see a little bit more of what is occurring, then we will start to see some movement. And you have seen in the European Union, they have now looked at intra-EU, which travel within the European Union, and looking at a mid-June date, I believe, for start of that. And then they have also now started to put out a time period for potential international. And we need those timeframes to be put out there so that consumers can see as of X date, travel restrictions and whatnot might be changing, and therefore they can make their plans. But that's the biggest piece now, is just the uncertainty and the lack of clarity on those dates.
Right. Phil, can I ask you how you see the fall? It's going to be a slow summer by the looks of it. Do you think things can pick up much by the fall?
Well, I'm going to pick up on a few comments that Mike just made, and in a way, I think it picks up on the similar narrative. It really does depend on when the restrictions are lifted, and those include in particular things like international travel that we're reliant on, especially because many of our visitors are from the US. We rely on them heavily in Canada, never mind, from elsewhere. And those borders will not be lifted, at least not for the foreseeable future. And then there's regions like what Keith was mentioning, where there are constraints and they're not going to allow people to enter those communities for a good amount of time. You add on top of that some declining economic conditions and things like canceled events, which account for a huge proportion of revenues in our summers. Think of all the kinds of sporting, outdoor events, weddings, etc. You're not going to see those remounted quickly, and they certainly won't happen in this calendar year. So they get deferred perhaps until next year or later, or in some other mode. So the large volume, high ROI events basically are lost. And for that reason, by the way, research tells us that we probably won't even see recovery on most of our tourism activity for a good 2 years. By the way, I should add to this, though, the sector is taking a lot of measures to try and accelerate recovery in spite of some of these constraints that are not within our control, I'm going to say. That the associations, for sure, that I'm well aware of, have been working with governments, with health authorities. You've seen a proliferation of recommendations on safety protocols. I would argue, by the way, the sector has taken some of the most stringent measures on this and some of the better work on it, in fact. There's been a big portion of effort gone into helping businesses sustain liquidity. The DC is now going to be mounting and has started to do a lot of work around promoting travel within Canada, domestic travel or staycations with new travel packages. And I got to add that a big part of our challenge is also trying to retain the workers in the sector. So many were impacted, but something has to happen there. That's 10% of the labor market that's been impacted, and we need those workers. After all, we're very dependent on our services being delivered from real people. So trying to hold on to those million workers for sure, or half the workforce, and looking for incentives to do that when we don't have the trade to offset those costs, it's a big challenge. So there are strategies in hand and at play with governments and with health authorities, but they're slow. They're slow to get moving, and I think it's going to take time. So the fall, I don't want to sound bleak, but I don't think the fall is going to look very different than what we're experiencing now. I do think there'll be more of a normal pattern of operating at a 30% capacity or less, generally speaking. But for many, that's just not going to be enough to sustain what they're doing.
Yeah. Now your council, the Tourism Human Resource Council, has been focused on upgrading skills of people in the sector. Is there room to focus on that a little bit now during this downturn?
Thank you for the question, Andrew. I think it's a very important one. We did work about 11 weeks ago looking at what happens during recovery models like this, and drew from the best examples we could find because there was nothing quite like it. But a resounding theme that shows up in past research is that investing in training during these modes is perhaps most important. It's because you need to retain workers in part for sure, but it's also because coming out of it, it's a very different ballgame. It's different skills, it's different demands. We're going to be working with fewer people that need more versatility and so on. But I would add that it's more than training that's needed, and it's more than skills upgrading that's required. We know, that unlike many economic sectors, tourism is basically a human capital intensive, right? I mean, in the end, the experience is really about the people behind it. So when you think about how the business will look different, it means that we have to recalibrate just about everything we do. So training is part of it. And in fact, as an organization, because we were funded by the federal government, we have put out free training with our online material. We had fantastic take up on that, and it certainly had filled a lot of the gap over these last several weeks, and we are building on it with more tools. But if you can indulge me for just a few more minutes longer here, the other thing that we know about the workforce is that our industry has been tapping into some of the Government of Canada relief programs, most notably the Emergency Wage Subsidy Program. Welcome relief for sure at 75%. Concern though is whether it's going to be out there long enough. We are pushing to try to make that a longer period of time than is currently set. Because the lag that will occur in the return from our sector. But there's also a regional relief and recovery fund, which appears to be underutilized or under-tapped from our sector. We're actually doing a little more research to look at what that looks like. And indeed, we do think some adjustments are going to be needed to that. And again, just a few more quick points. We also know HR plans have to be overhauled significantly. We're starting to see some of that because, of course, there's new protocols, there's new working arrangements. They have to learn also how to deal with things like pandemics. You can imagine, for example, if you had a client come in who had the coronavirus, and then what's the protocols you have to follow? Or what if a staff person contracts it and you've had all these contact points, et cetera? So there's quite a bit involved there. And by the way, depending on the type of operation you are, if you're a hotel, you might be sanctioned all of a sudden as a space that has to be quarantined. So these kinds of protocols are quite unique and a little different and do require a full range of new guidance and protocols and skills and more essential workers, by the way. So we are promoting things like also community development initiatives around labor because in small communities, it's not singularly the tourism businesses that have to address the issue. It has to be a community-led approach. So, I mean, there's a lot more to be said in that, but indeed, jobs will change. A lot of uncertainty will also mean that we have a decreased ability to attract and retain workers. The precarity will grow. We'll see a lot more part-time jobs, not full-time, as we try to recover. So there's a challenge ahead for sure.
Yeah. Sarah, can I ask you about your restaurant? So the Metropolitan Brasserie is a well-known place in Ottawa, a restaurant, a watering hole for Parliament Hill and the political crowd, which are all gone for now. And you've been closed totally until now. How do you see things rolling out over the next few weeks? What's your plan or hopeful plan?
Hopeful plan, yeah. I hope people come out, I guess.
Yeah.
Point one is I hope people come out. And I hope they're assured that businesses like ours are doing all that we can to make sure that things are safe, because the last thing we want to happen is for this sector to be shut down again, because no one would survive that. So what does it look like? It's going to look like very different from it looked before. You're going to see staff wearing masks. You're going to see a lot of sanitation happening. You're going to see, I mentioned it when we were talking before, but the social distancing between tables, social distancing between parties at tables. And for now here in Ontario, only outside seating, so no indoor seating. It's going to be interesting to see what the uptake is after the first couple of weeks, and if people are getting adjusted to what the new reality looks like, and if more people are coming out. I think there's some stats out there around that, and around how many people we're expecting to see start to come out and dine out, and people are still quite apprehensive about it. You know, I saw a stat yesterday on another webinar I was on saying, I think it was saying 56% of people are going to go to small gatherings with their friends and family. And of that, about 27% actually are only looking to dine out. So that's a huge number. When you've had no sales, and like you said earlier, this is the time where you make hay. You know, May, June, July, August, that's when you're making your money and you're getting your reserves in place to put you through the winter. So if we're looking at reduced numbers like that, the winter time is just going to be catastrophic.
Well, and you're going to, what kind of percentage are you going to be able to open this week, as opposed to your whole restaurant? Because now you've got a large space, but your entire inside is closed, and the patio is going to be down to a small proportion, right?
Yeah, we're lucky where we are. We have a very large courtyard that was untapped, and with the expansion allowances, our patio will be significantly larger in size than it was. But the number of tables that are on that patio will actually still be less than were out there before. So we'll probably be at slightly more than 50% of what we were, but not by much. I would say probably about 55–60% of what our patio looked like before, just given that social distancing. Even though we had that extra space, it gets eaten up really quickly when you're putting, 7.5 feet between customers. It disappears very quickly.
But that's 55 of the patio, but the entire inside is.
And the entire inside is done, scrapped. Yeah.
Keith, what are you sensing about how things go rolling from the summer to the fall? Is the fall looking any better?
No, I think the reality is, I didn't, just to put this in the context, I think we have to help people appreciate the blunt reality of what we're facing. So for us, we're going to probably lose about 600 of our businesses to bankruptcy in the next 2 to 3 months. Out of 1,800. So I don't think people, so when I say what the fall is going to look like right now, unless the business comes back at a really feasible rate, it'll actually be more than that. So these are hotels, these are restaurants that are Indigenous owned and operated, they're cultural centers, they're, outdoor adventure. These are a very large variety of businesses. And right now we forecast minimally, we're going to lose about 600 businesses to bankruptcy by August. So they just, without an actual paying customer, we just simply can't. The entrepreneurs and the ownership can't justify. It's to the point that was made about the restaurant closing because it was small, and it's the same challenges we have. Like 20% of our paying customers came from the U.S. Well, that's completely gone. 55% of Canadians, and typically they would come from province to province or the territory. But we don't even know how much of that, because we're also seeing the same intel that a lot of visitors are going to be very apprehensive, going farther than 100 kilometers away from home. So for many of our rural, remote businesses, they just simply aren't going to be feasible anymore. And so the fall is not looking good. Unless there's a massive change in the shift of the customer, I have to, again, the other angle, this is 45% of our paying customers came from outside of Canada, but they spent 60% of the money. So there's not many business, doesn't matter how great and intelligent you are at business modeling, it's just simply not feasible without a good portion of that. And so I'm saying that the fall will depend on some very serious thoughts by partners, meaning government as well. Are we going to create liquidity programs that are going to help businesses survive this or not? Because if we don't see adjustments to the kind of financing options for Indigenous tourism businesses, we're going to lose more than 600 businesses is what we predict. So, and that's permanently. These are gone, insolvent and bankrupt. So I don't think the solutions yet meet what's in front of us. So for me, the fall, really what we're trying to do is save as many businesses as we can to stay moderately open. And I don't mean to sound sort of grave about it, but it is a reality. We have business owners across this country, going through significant stress. And I really feel that a lot of the policy and discussions we have don't appreciate that the frank reality is people's lives are on the line, and these businesses are going to go bankrupt. And just because they're Indigenous or not doesn't mean they have access to extra money. So it's a tough time. It's really hard to understand how we're going to survive this, to be honest, right now.
And I'm guessing for a lot of the remote and rural areas like the Haida Gwais, they are really counting on the summer tourists. And if they're not going to be able to bring them in over the summer, it's game over for the next 9 months.
It absolutely is. We're already, as of May 1st, we're losing 280 million per month collectively in revenue. I mean, so Haida Gwais, their revenue over the 4 months is about 16 to 17 million in revenue. That's all right now. It's largely gone. So what business can survive without that kind of revenue coming in? So it's a very serious challenge in front of us. And I think collectively we continue to urge for other ways that we can save this industry, because I really feel people haven't realized the full scope of what's going to happen to tourism. We may want to rebuild in 2 to 3 years, but what's going to be left to rebuild with if we don't do something different?
So I want to talk about travel, and I'll ask Phil and Sarah to comment briefly on the idea of local tourism being the answer. Do you think there's going to be enough local tourists? Sarah, you mentioned people driving up from Toronto to Ottawa. I mean, is driving tourism going to be your savior? And then I'll ask Mike what that means for the airline industry if everybody just does local tourism. So Phil, if you can give us your thoughts about local tourism.
A lot of the research and indeed some of the decisions about marketing for the sector have focused on domestic or local tourism, probably because it's really one of the very few options that we can lean on at the time. There are still a lot of concerns. Again, I don't want to sound overly bleak here, but we all know that although some people are very eager to try to get out and get a chance to experience some travel or take a holiday, what we're anticipating is that they're going to be road trips. They're probably going to be shorter in duration. They tend to be more thrifty because of the need to be a little more austere with concerns about budgets and so on. So yes, we are going to rely more on the domestic travel, local travel, perhaps the very micro local travel. But we also think that from a revenue point of view, it's going to be far reduced. And also I should add to it that part of this effort to attract these travelers is really about businesses having to think very differently about the products and services that they offer. You have to remember that basically it's a different target than many would have been doing. And it doesn't mean you offer the same thing. They're gonna want to have things that are more aligned with their interests. And taking some time to sort that out is going to be quite an interesting challenge. There was an example that Sarah noted earlier that we're probably most aware of, like restaurants who have done a lot of takeout, who've moved to chef's packages you can take home, things like that. That's an example of repackaging what they're doing to try to appeal to local markets, because it's pretty much the only real options they have. But I'll add, a lot of those activities are going to help them maybe keep the door open, but they're not necessarily profitable or sustainable. And I guess that becomes the real challenge. How long can they sustain doing this when it's a very limited market for a limited period of time?
Yeah, and if the delivery company is taking 30% of the bill, that leaves quite a bit less in the hands of the restaurant. Sarah, what are your thoughts about local tourism as a savior?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be a savior. I think it's gonna rely heavily on loyal customers at this point. Customer bases you built in the past and their loyalty to you and wanting you to survive. I don't think that there's gonna be enough new local traffic to keep us through. I think that it'll sustain us keeping our doors open whilst the programs the government has out right now are in effect, but when they dry up, the business is going to go under. The subsidy will help, get you rejigging your business model and adapting and training your employees to the new procedures, but once the rent subsidy is gone and the wage subsidy, you're going to be in real trouble because you're not going to be able to pay your rent on strictly takeout business. And a reduced capacity of, somewhere 30%, some 50%, depending on what you can fit in. It's just not, the model is not there. You cannot afford it. You cannot pay the bills you were paying before with the revenue you're going to be receiving. And you can only put your prices up so much because people, like we were saying, their wallets are a little thinner. Not everybody has as much disposable income. A lot of people have lost their jobs, been laid off. So it's a domino effect problem.
Yeah. And Mike, what are your thoughts about local tourism? That means all those people who do local tourism won't be flying anywhere.
I think the local tourism piece is obviously absolutely necessary. It obviously can have some benefit then to the other elements of the economy. I think there is some potential for flying within local, depending on how you define local. But I do think it still all comes back to, and the points that other panelists are making, that it's a bit of a stopgap piece that maybe can help for a bit of a period of time. But again, until we get to the border measures and the travel restrictions in a coordinated fashion of addressing what those are and alleviating, and you are seeing those conversations now in other countries and other jurisdictions, it's not going to be a solution. None of this will be a solution. They're all just interim measures. And to Keith's point, Indigenous tourism having a record year through 2019. From the airline sector, we look at where we entered in January of 2020, and the level of service and flights to small communities and large communities, and taking that inbound tourism, and part of the government's agenda obviously was to pursue this, to take that inbound tourism and take it beyond just the big hubs and get it into all the smaller regions of the country. And so people can obviously experience what those regions have to offer. Where we've come from, where we were to where we are now, has just been an incredible destruction of what had been built up over the past 5 years. And if you look at over the past 10 years, globally and in Canada, we had an increase every year in the number of people flying and passengers. And that, of course, is then driving into the tourism markets and throughout the local economies. The latest info that has come out from, I think it was IATA the other day, is a 50% drop in numbers through 2020 is what it's now looking at. And as every week goes by, those numbers have gotten worse. A 50% drop for 2020, and in 2021, if there is not a second wave and carry on into 2021, maybe the numbers get to globally what they were in 2014, which is a sizable reduction, and that speaks to I think it was Keith that was making the point that it's going to take years to build back to what we entered and what everyone looked at in January 2020, and the status we had and the economy we had in January 2020.
So Keith and Sarah, can you just comment on this, on the point Mike mentioned just now about it'll take 2 or 3 years to build up? Why is that? If we have there is a view out there that there's going to be a solution to COVID by early next year, and everything will be back to normal, and people will travel lots next summer. Will that be the case?
You want to go first, Sarah?
Go for it.
Like why is it going to take 2 or 3 years? Why is the recovery going to take 2 or 3 years as opposed to all happen next year?
Well, from an Indigenous tourism perspective, there's a combination of things. First of all, it's going to be the supply reality. If we don't have as many businesses to bring back to market, that's just a reality of what we're going to do. What can we offer for experiences across the country? So first of all, we have a supply challenge in the immediate future that will carry on. So if we lose, as we believe, at least 600 businesses, that's going to bring us as an industry back to below 2003 levels, not 2014. So we've been tracking this for the last 20 years of the size and the actual employment numbers, and that's we'll be below 2003 levels. So we just can't offer the same things to Canadians and to the world. So there's a supply issue. On the demand side, there may be demand, but as Phil and I think Sarah mentioned, what we're already seeing is the sentiment that people are worried about confidence of the pocketbook, that's going to knock. And for us, Indigenous tourism is often an add-on to a visit, an add-on to a holiday. So what that becomes with those discretionary spends is often they lose confidence. They may not do discretionary things as much. So that's a confidence issue with consumers. And as the third, I would say, is the international border reality. Just because we say we're open doesn't mean the international community is going to come. We worked hard with Destination Canada and others to market Canada. We're going to have to go back almost, I would argue, maybe like square one, building in our core markets, 13 core markets in the world. It's going to take a lot of heavy lifting to reestablish confidence that Canada is a safe destination. We've been hit hard with COVID. The rest of the world may not think Canada is as safe as we think it is. So we have, I think, a lot of collective challenges. So I believe the same with Mike and Phil and everyone else that I think we're looking at a 3 to 5 year full recovery. It won't just be click, the doors open, and away we go. We're back to 2019 levels. It's going to take us years. We had to fight tooth and nail to get to that level that we were at 2019. It's very competitive in the international space. So it's going to take a lot of lifting again to rebrand market Canada as part of our messaging safe for everyone.
And if I could jump in, Andrew, I'm sorry, Sarah, but just to add to a point that Keith made about the supply, I'm just going to extend this narrative on reminding people that things like large scale events or annual events, which has really impacted us over these summer months, the return of those events are perhaps most precarious because they've been decimated and they don't necessarily have the funds as well to remount easily, nor may they be able to if there's still uncertainty about COVID. You know, this thing is maybe not going to go away. We might just manage to learn to work with it to some extent. But will we be able to bring large crowds together? Will we be able to bring back annual events of that ilk? Probably not easily, and not for a while. So these organizations that are running these things tend to operate on a fairly tight budget that maybe only comes up once a year. So the missing this cycle means they're in a deficit, and then trying to recover from that and then mount it for the next series with the risk proposition and maybe not even getting insurance. I mean, these things start to really unravel their ability to do these things, and their risk proposition is too high. So many will just decide to skip a year or to not to do it at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to pick up on that event part two there, like I myself, when I travel, like to travel for events, be it concerts, sporting events. Those are some of the main drivers for me when I travel. And with those events not happening, I may not be going to those locations anymore. And also on that point too, I would say I'm being, thinking I'm going to want to travel within Canada to support our economy here. And I would expect other countries are going to be thinking the same, where they're going to be in a similar boat and they're going to want to keep building their own local economy and keeping their businesses afloat. I will say Ottawa Tourism has launched a passport that they're doing. I think it's coming out next week, but they're working on that kind of local thing where you're going to get a local passport, and each business or hotel or experience is going to have a special discount to kind of drive the local people to come out and get a free, frites at the Met or get a 2-for-1 discount on a rafting excursion or something like that. You're going to see a lot of that too, I think.
Yeah, so it's what this discussion reminds me a little bit about is the movie The Field of Dreams, with that famous line, if you build it, they will come. And it seems like you're saying that it's possible that you could build it and they won't come.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that must leave you cold if you think about that. We've had a number of questions. Let me go to a couple of questions. We may not be able to get through them all, but we'll try. So the first is, tourism is a key resource. Sorry, I'm trying to read here through my bifocals. Tourism is a key source of funding for nature and cultural conservation across the world. Has the panel considered this issue in the Canadian context? So how will tourism help or be unable to help nature and cultural national conservation? Maybe
Well, I'm
Keith
not,
would ask.
yeah, I mean, indigenous tourism, a lot of our tourism is ecotourism, a lot is adventure tourism. It's about preserving territories and wildlife viewing and so forth. So yeah, it's very much a driving force the way we develop a lot of our businesses across the country with local indigenous nations and communities and entrepreneurs. So it's very much, you look at the Great Bear Rainforest here in BC, the national parks, many of the businesses like Gats, and we have a lot of experiences. But I think that I have to stress though that the no matter where those businesses are, they have to have some feasibility behind it. So those businesses particularly see a lot of international and US visitors, and well, just international is what I mean by that. And so that is going to be, so that's the kind of concern I have, is that if those experiences are gone, how are we going to rebuild post-COVID impact? So very much a big part of nature conservancy, wildlife viewing, not harvesting, and these big part of indigenous experience across the country. But those businesses are all part of our network of folks saying, what are we going to do for 20? So most of our businesses in that example have just completely shut operations for sure for 2020. So even if 2020 reopens in some form, a lot of those businesses are just going to close operations to minimize the effect of their overall cash flow. So that's an unfortunate outcome in other ways, but we're moving forward, and that is going to be the critical piece to rebuild come post-COVID-19.
Yeah, and there was a question about refunds. Keith, some of your operators, if they've got situations where they're closing or not able to provide the service that people have paid for, how are they able to handle refunds? What's happening out there?
That's a big issue for us. I mean, a lot of our businesses are working with clients. They might have regular policies that say they will refund, and they try to do that. But that's actually what's particularly bankrupting a lot of the small businesses. Some of our smaller operators had $200,000 in book business and prepaid business that have been completely lost. And they're not. A lot of our businesses have only been developed in the last 3 to 10 years, let's say max. They haven't got the kind of cash reserves that can just lose that 200,000 without serious. So when I say bankruptcy, a lot of our business was through travel agents and booking agents and was prepaid. And so that's what's really hurting us. It's not just a matter of shutting our doors. Our businesses just don't have the cash flow to honor those things easily. Yeah. And so these are really big risks for our sector right now.
Yeah, I can speak to that too. Yeah. We, as you know, operate a large function space here. So we do a lot of huge events, be them lobby events, parliamentary receptions, book launches, and whatnot. And essentially every single one of my large events has been canceled through November. They're already done. A number of them obviously had deposits put down on them. We try to encourage to allow us to keep the deposit and rebook down the line, but some places aren't in a space where they're in a position to do that, to let us hold on to that. So if you start refunding every single deposit that you've received, like Keith was saying, you're quickly in deep water there for sure.
Is there any sense that the government might intervene and help out? Sorry, Phil, did you want to comment on that?
I was just going to say, or underscore, maybe reiterate that you have to remember that a lot of these deposits are probably have gone to some real costs that these operators have already had to pay for, right? They, to Keith's point about cash flow, they rely on these deposits in order to purchase kinds of goods and services that they're going to need and ready for the consumer. So, they would have spent a good portion of those, and those costs would have been borne by them. So to refund is a very big challenge because it puts them in a major deficit, and and then often those things that they've had to purchase or invest in don't get utilized or they're squandered. So it's a real difficult scenario.
Right. I have another question for Mike with regards to the aviation industry. As you are opening up and planning the future, are you aligning with other countries? Are the international aviation organizations playing a part in an international process of opening up?
That's certainly the intent. At the outset, I'd mentioned the ICAO, which is a body of the UN, International Civil Aviation Organization, and the release of their CART report last week. And the European Aviation Safety Authority came out with their release about 2 weeks ago. So certainly the intent is to try and get consistent approaches globally. And also then have consistent approaches for domestic operations, because you're simply taking those standard operating procedures and you're putting them at a domestic level as well. And it is all wrapped around giving consumers the confidence they need and employees the confidence they need. And has been mentioned, I think, earlier in the panel, and aviation is no different. There has been a lot of work done both by air carriers and by airports and regulators to date already in terms of best practices. But yes, and I know you've asked me a very straightforward question that I've given a very long answer to, but yes, the intent is absolutely to do that.
Yeah. A question for all of you. Has the government got it right in terms of closures and openings? Oh, and maybe not your view. What is your industry thinking?
I don't know that I want to refer to it as a government issue per se. Look, what we know is that Canada is a very large territory, and there are very different scenarios by region, appropriately so. So it's spotty. It's the regulations that they've chosen to impose or lift are variable across the land. So there's no level of agreement or consistency on a number of those things. Indeed, even the protocols for reopening. So in part, what we hear a lot of, and by the way, I field many calls on, is more about the confusion and understanding what is expected, how to tap into or access the kinds of tools that they need, like PPE, which are scarce. But indeed, from a consumer point of view, we also hear from and see from our research that it's translated into lack of confidence and uncertainty about what the sector will be able to manage in terms of safety and health protocols, because they see mixed messages and uncertainty about what it means, and they experience different things wherever they may go or for what they look after. And finally, also it impacts our supplier base. That's another sort of major community or stakeholder, if you want, who also is subject to different kinds of regulations and protocols. So to put it in shorthand, Andrew, what we hear from the market mostly is confusion, uncertainty, a need for clarity and coherence, and with the hope that there'll be a little more consistency in how some of these things will play out. But I think given the nature of the way this is playing out, we're in for another 4 to 6 months of very uneven activity in terms of how this will start to recover.
Andrew,
Okay,
can I just add to that?
Go ahead, please.
I think I'm not a health expert, so I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but what I can tell you is not effective is the current solutions for our industry around certain, like whether it's the business credit availability program or the emergency business account. Those are helpful, but the CEBA, it does very little for our sector because it's very small, $40,000. The large BCAP through the major financial institutions are a challenge, because for many of our tourism businesses, because of this entire situation, they are being denied, even though they're backstopped. The banks are the banks are the banks, and they want to see feasible financing. And that is a big issue for our sector that has yet to be, I know government works on this, I know we're sharing this. So I think it's not so much that the government or the closures, right? It's about, have we put in the right measures to save as many businesses if we want tourism or not? I don't think we have.
And what does it take? Takes more money, right?
Well, I don't know if it's more money, but what I would say, it's helping maybe secure 100% of those loans. So banks remove some of the fear and apprehension, the major financial institutions. It's longer amortization. It's deferring the first payment for 12 months. Those are practical things that I think if we really want to see the sector, I don't think I think Canadians want us to also not just get money from government. That's fair. But at the same time, if we're going to save the sector, we have to create loan structures that our businesses can access. And right now, it's not effective.
Right, okay. I had told you, panel, that you'd have a minute at the end, but I'm going to change that plan because we have a real fun question here that's just come in. It's from Ian Waddell, who's a former MP and tourism minister in BC. He was an MLA in BC as well. And I will add, is an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. So thank you, Ian, for that question. And this is his question, which is a good one to sum up on. If I were to speak to the BC Premier today, and my guess is he might be doing that, what should he ask for the industry on your behalf? What are the one or two things you'd suggest he should be asking the BC Premier? Mike, you go first. Put you on the spot.
It would be a national, organized, coherent restart program with respect to border and travel restrictions based on looking at what is going on in other jurisdictions around the world, a number of which have started those conversations and have started to put dates out that industry can plan around and consumers can plan around, in particular the European Union, and achieve a level of consistency across the country. That's going to be a fairly large ask, but that's how I would view it.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Keith, what would your ask be?
Well, I would ask him to say to the Premier and then to the tourism minister, there's weekly tourism ministers meetings with the country with Minister Jolie, and I would just continue to urge things like coordination of a national approach to restarting tourism, both domestically and internationally, but also what is specifically being done to help some of the tourism sectors more detailed. I mean, access to capital and that liquidity challenge remains number one, and there is a perception in the public that the industries and the dev sectors are getting all this help and access to loans, and it's not materializing the way people think it is. So I think we just need a rethink on and adjustment to the way it's being done.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, what would you ask Ian Waddell to say?
I can't really comment too much on the restaurant situation in BC. I mean, I know they're open, but I don't know too much about what's going on specifically. I would certainly echo the sentiments about cohesive results and plans. Geez, that's a tough one for me because like I said, I'm not really in the loop on what's happening out there.
If you were asking your Premier, what would be the?
I would say we really need to be flagging and continuing the conversation on the longevity of the problem for this sector. This is not over once, restrictions start to ease. This is not over in September. It is just going to get worse for us, and we really need to focus on what a long-term help looks like.
Okay, and should he invite Premier Horgan to your restaurant too?
Sure, yeah, patio's open on Friday.
Phil Mondor, what would you want Ian?
Well, I think I'm in a way repeating some of what all the other panelists say. One thing that strikes me is that there are some good initiatives that government has undertaken, but I think what it's been expressed a lot on the call and perhaps just on this last round is that they're not necessarily fit for the sector. The sector has unique needs. It's going to be facing this problem longer than the rest of the economy. These programs that are out there need to be adjusted to fit our context better, and they're going to have to last longer. There's certainly a lot of work being done by the industry itself. Leaders have really stepped up, both in terms of the governments and the associations and others. And the voices are there. I think the solutions are understood, but basically some adjustments need to be made to these programs if we think we're going to survive. And it's more about looking at the long game, not the short term.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Phil Mondor, Mike McNaney, Sarah Chown, and Keith Henry. Thank you for participating in this. It's an interesting time and everybody's very busy with their own lives, but I think what you've given us a chance to really look into your industry and see what's happening. And I hope people understand how devastating it is and how deep the problem is. I mean, the sense that you've talked that it's going to take several years to come out of this is one that probably most people out there don't get. We sort of think this is going to be a temporary problem. In a few months, we'll be back at your restaurants and hotels and flying here and there, and that's not going to be the case. So thank you very much for doing this. I hope we carry on this discussion and invite you back in a few months to see how things are going. To our viewers, thanks for joining us today. Please keep an eye on our website. We will continue to have these webinars over the next few weeks. The next one on Friday, the 12th of June, is going to be on racism. It's called Racism, COVID and Beyond, and we'll be talking about various aspects of racism that have become very topical and of great concern to Canadians and indeed the world over the last few weeks. So please join us for that on Friday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And thanks everybody, and thanks again to the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.